My husband humiliated me at dinner, saying I was useless. But then, I stood up and said, the evening was meant to be special. The table was set with the finest china, the wine glasses sparkled under the chandelier, and the aroma of slow-roasted lamb filled the dining room. A woman had spent the entire day preparing the perfect meal, hoping to impress her husband and his colleagues. She had arranged everything meticulously, ensuring that even the floral centerpiece complemented the elegance of the evening. But as she set down the final dish, her husband, seated at the head of the table, smirked and let out a scoff. "This is what you spent your whole day doing?" he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Honestly, I don't know what I expected. You don't work, you don't contribute. The least you could do is get a simple dinner right." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, and an uncomfortable silence spread across the room. The guests exchanged glances, some looking down at their plates, pretending they hadn't heard the cruel remark. She felt her throat tighten, but she forced a smile, willing herself not to show weakness. "I just wanted to make something special," she said softly. But he laughed, a cold, condescending laugh that made her skin crawl. "Special? You don't even know the meaning of the word. Maybe if you ever accomplished anything on your own, you'd understand." The weight of his words crushed her. She had spent years supporting him, standing by his side while he built his career, sacrificing her own aspirations to ensure their home ran smoothly. Yet, here he was, reducing her existence to nothing more than an inconvenience. Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists beneath the table. For so long, she had remained silent, swallowing every belittling comment, every dismissive glance. But this time, something inside her cracked. She took a deep breath, feeling the burn of humiliation mix with something else, something unfamiliar yet powerful. As she looked around the table, she saw the pity in some eyes, the amusement in others, and, in her husband's expression, a complete lack of remorse. The woman who had spent years shrinking herself into a shadow of his success suddenly felt something she hadn't in years. Resentment. And for the first time, she was ready to push back. The dinner continued, but the food had lost its taste. Conversations resumed hesitantly, as if no one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. Her husband's colleagues laughed at his jokes, but there was a strained undertone to their amusement. She sat still, forcing herself to chew, though every bite felt like swallowing glass. Her mind raced, replaying his words over and over again. She had dedicated years to supporting him, moving cities when his job required it, leaving behind friends, hobbies, and any aspirations of her own. She had been there through his sleepless nights, comforting him when work stress consumed him, celebrating every milestone in his career as if it were her own. And yet, he dismissed her as if she were a mere footnote in his life. She could feel the burn of unshed tears behind her eyes, but she refused to cry, not in front of him, not in front of people who saw her as nothing more than the quiet wife in the background. She had always believed that love meant standing by each other, being a team. But how could she stand beside a man who took every opportunity to tear her down? She glanced around the room, catching glimpses of the different reactions from the guests. One woman, a wife of one of her husband's associates, gave her a sympathetic look, as if to say, "I know what you're going through." Another man cleared his throat awkwardly and looked away. But worst of all were the ones who smirked, who seemed to enjoy the show her husband was putting on at her expense. How had she become this? A woman whose worth was determined by the cruelty of the man she once loved? She had been strong once, full of ambition and dreams. She had imagined a life where she and her husband were equals, where they built something together. Instead, she had given and given, only to be left with nothing but empty hands and an even emptier heart. Her husband's voice broke through her thoughts again. "Honestly, I don't even know what you do all day," he said, shaking his head. "You should be grateful I put up with it." The final blow. The last crack in the fragile composure she had been holding on to. She took a deep breath, pushing back her chair with a slow, deliberate motion. The room fell silent again. And then, she spoke. Her voice, calm yet unwavering, cut through the silence. "If I am so useless, then tell me why." She paused, locking eyes with him, watching as his smirk faltered for the first time that night. "Why do you still need me to handle every little thing in your life?" A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the shift in power. She had never spoken back to him in public before, had never dared to question him. But something in her had changed. "You want to talk about contribution?" she continued, standing to her full height. "Who makes sure the bills are paid on time? Who arranges every business dinner so you can impress your colleagues? Who keeps our home running so you can focus on your job?" Her husband's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged. For the first time, her husband looked uneasy. His fingers tightened around his fork, his smirk gone. He had always relied on her silence, had always assumed she would simply endure. But tonight, the woman he had belittled was no longer willing to shrink herself to fit his world. The guests exchanged glances. Some whispered to each other, while others watched in stunned silence. No one had expected her to push back. Least of all, him. She could feel the rapid beating of her heart, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had spent too many years allowing herself to be erased. Tonight, that was going to end. As the weight of her words settled over the room, she pushed back her chair, the sound of wood scraping against marble echoing in the stunned silence. Without another glance at her husband, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking with quiet determination. The guests remained frozen, uncertain whether to acknowledge the tension or pretend as if nothing had happened. Her husband's face remained impassive, but she knew she had shattered something inside him. Perhaps it was his pride, perhaps it was the illusion of control he had held over her for years. Each step she took felt lighter, as if she was shedding years of self-doubt, years of swallowing her voice, years of being reduced to nothing. By the time she reached their bedroom, her breath was steady, her hands no longer trembling. She shut the door behind her, locking out the whispers, the judgment, and most importantly, him. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to seek his approval. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the evening's events. Every word he had thrown at her, every condescending glance, every smirk, she had memorized them all. Yet, unlike before, the pain didn't consume her. Instead, there was a quiet, simmering resolve taking its place. She had spoken back. She had walked away. And now, she had a choice: continue living in the shadow of a man who belittled her or step into the light of her own worth. Downstairs, she heard muffled voices, her husband's colleagues making their hurried exits, sensing that they had overstayed in the wake of his embarrassment. She wondered if he was angry, if his ego had been bruised beyond repair. But she found that she didn't care. His feelings were no longer her responsibility. What mattered now was what came next. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by his expectations. The next morning, she woke to an empty house. There was no scent of fresh coffee, no murmured conversations from the kitchen. The silence was heavy but not unwelcome. As she stepped downstairs, she noticed that his briefcase was gone. He had left for work early, avoiding any confrontation. Perhaps he thought ignoring what happened would make it disappear. But she had no intention of letting it fade into another unspoken wound. She made herself breakfast, a rare act of self-care that she had long abandoned. As she sipped her coffee, she allowed herself to sit with the unfamiliar feeling of self-possession. There was something liberating about the absence of his presence. For once, she wasn't waiting for his approval, wasn't anticipating his moods. She was simply existing on her own terms. And that, in itself, felt like the first step towards something greater. She spent the day in quiet reflection, walking through the house she had dedicated years to maintaining. Every room was filled with pieces of their life together, photos from vacations, furniture they had chosen as newlyweds, gifts exchanged in the early years of their marriage. But as she studied them now, she realized something painful: none of it truly belonged to her. Every decision, every memory, every moment had been shaped by his needs, his ambitions, his desires. The realization was sobering. Had she ever truly lived for herself? Had she ever made a choice that wasn't dictated by what he wanted? The thought unsettled her, but it also ignited something deep within, a hunger for more. More than just being a wife, more than just existing in his world. She didn't know what that more looked like yet, but she was ready to find out. That evening, he came home later than usual, stepping inside with the same air of quiet authority he had always carried. But this time, she didn't rush to greet him. She didn't ask about his day, didn't serve him dinner, didn't fill the silence with empty pleasantries. Instead, she remained seated at the dining table, her gaze steady as she watched him hesitate at the doorway. For the first time, she saw something unfamiliar in his expression: uncertainty. Perhaps he had expected her to be apologetic, to make excuses for her defiance, to pretend as if nothing had happened. But she didn't. She simply sat there, unmoved, unyielding. And in that moment, he realized that something between them had shifted. She was no longer the woman who bent beneath his words. She was no longer afraid of the space he left behind. He poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate. "You embarrassed me last night," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. It wasn't anger, it was something else. A desperate attempt to regain control. She watched as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, waiting for her to react, to explain, to justify herself. But she remained silent. When the silence stretched too long, he scoffed. "You're acting ridiculous. You took things too personally." His words were familiar, rehearsed, another manipulation designed to make her doubt herself. But she didn't. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "You just never expected me to speak." The words hit him harder than she expected, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, tense distance. He still expected things to return to normal, but she had no intention of playing along. She no longer prepared his meals, no longer lingered in the same rooms as him, no longer filled the silence with conversations he never truly valued. And he noticed. For the first time in their marriage, he began to feel her absence, not just physically, but emotionally. The house no longer revolved around him. And that realization unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. At first, he tried to ignore it. He convinced himself that she was simply sulking, that this was just another mood she would eventually snap out of. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized something unsettling: she wasn't waiting for him to fix things. She wasn't waiting for anything at all. He came home to find her reading in the living room, lost in a book she had never allowed herself time to enjoy. He watched as she scheduled a lunch with an old friend, someone she had lost touch with because of his disapproval. He noticed the way she no longer moved around him like an invisible presence, waiting for his acknowledgement. She was reclaiming herself. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure where he fit in her world anymore. The realization hit him on an ordinary night. He had come home expecting dinner, only to find an empty kitchen. She had always been there, waiting, making sure everything was in place. But not tonight. He wandered through the house, searching for her, only to find her in their bedroom, casually scrolling through her phone. "Did you eat?" he asked, expecting her usual concern. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Yes." Just that. No explanation, no apology, no attempt to soften the blow. It was such a simple response, but it carried the weight of every unspoken shift between them. For the first time, he understood he wasn't the center of her world anymore. And the thought terrified him. For years, he had been the one who dictated the rhythm of their lives. She had always adjusted, always anticipated his needs before he even voiced them. But now, something was different. He noticed the absence of her warmth before bed, the lack of conversation over breakfast. The house was colder, not because of the temperature, but because she was no longer filling it with quiet care. He had assumed that if he ignored the change, it would disappear. Instead, it was growing, taking up space in a way he couldn't control. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but it was in the small things, the way she no longer set his coffee beside him in the morning, the way she left the room whenever he entered, the way she barely looked at him anymore. It wasn't hostility. It was indifference. And that, more than anger, was what unsettled him the most. For the first time, he realized that he might not be the one in control anymore. One evening, he came home expecting her to be there, waiting as she always had. Instead, the house was empty. No scent of dinner in the air, no faint sound of music playing in the background. He checked his phone, no missed calls, no messages. A sharp pang of unease settled in his chest. He had taken her presence for granted for so long that the idea of coming home to nothing felt foreign. He sat at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers against the wood, waiting. Hours passed before she walked through the door, her expression unreadable. She placed her purse down, glancing at him without emotion. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice even, but betraying the frustration he was trying to suppress. She shrugged. "Out." Just that. No explanation. No attempt to soothe his discomfort. And for the first time, he realized what it felt like to be the one left wondering. He had always believed that she needed him. That without him, her life would lack purpose, that she would be lost. But as the days passed, he began to see the truth. She had built her life around him, not because she was incapable of existing without him, but because she had chosen to. And now, she was choosing differently. That terrified him more than anything. He had spent so much time convincing himself of his importance that he had never stopped to consider what would happen if she no longer saw him as necessary. One evening, as they sat in the same room, silence stretching between them, he cleared his throat. "You're different," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. She didn't look up from her book. "Maybe I just stopped being who you wanted me to be." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every moment she had swallowed her pain, every sacrifice she had made for him. He realized then that he wasn't sure if she even loved him anymore. He had always assumed that if he ever made a mistake, an apology would fix it. But now, he wasn't sure if an apology would be enough. It wasn't just about what he had said at dinner. It was about years of neglect, years of treating her as an afterthought. He wanted to tell her that he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to make her feel small. But the words felt empty in his mouth. What good was an apology when the damage had already been done? That night, he lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully beside him. He used to take comfort in knowing that she was always there, that no matter what, she would wake up and still be his. But now, he wasn't so sure. She had built a life without him even while sharing a home with him. And the scariest part? She seemed perfectly fine. The next morning, he made an effort. It wasn't grand, not yet, but it was something. He brewed her coffee the way she liked it, setting it on the table before she came downstairs. When she entered the kitchen, she glanced at it briefly, then at him. There was no softening in her expression, no appreciation in her eyes. She simply took the cup and sat down, sipping in silence. The absence of gratitude stung more than it should have. He cleared his throat. "I was thinking we could have dinner together tonight. Just us." She didn't look up. "I already have plans." That was new. She had never made plans without consulting him before. And it wasn't just that she had plans, it was the way she said it, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He realized then that he had spent years assuming she would always be available. But she wasn't waiting for him anymore. As the days passed, he found himself watching her more closely. Noticing the way she moved through life now, lighter, freer. She laughed more, though never with him. She spent her evenings reading, going out, reconnecting with a version of herself that he had never truly known. He wanted to ask her if she was happy. But deep down, he already knew the answer. One evening, as he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he caught sight of his own reflection. He looked tired. Not from work, not from stress, but from the weight of his own mistakes. He had built himself up by tearing her down, and now that she was no longer beneath him, he didn't know who he was anymore. He was forced to face the truth. Without her, he was just a man. And he didn't like the man he had become. Regret was not something he was used to carrying, but it sat heavy in his chest now. He wondered if she knew, if she could see the way his confidence had started to crack, the way his arrogance had begun to erode. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, to ask if it was too late, but he didn't know how. He had never learned the language of humility. That evening, he found himself standing at their bedroom door, watching as she packed a bag. "Going somewhere?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She didn't stop folding her clothes. "Just for the weekend." A simple answer, yet it felt like the final blow. She was leaving. Maybe not forever. Maybe not yet. But for the first time, he realized that he might not get to decide how this ended. The thought of losing her had always been theoretical. Something he never actually considered possible. But as he watched her close the suitcase, as he saw the way she no longer looked at him with expectation, he understood that he had already lost something. Perhaps not her entirely, but the version of her that once loved him unconditionally. He swallowed hard, the words on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say them. "Have a good trip," was all he managed. She didn't pause, didn't hesitate. She simply picked up her bag and walked past him. And as the front door closed behind her, he realized something else. He was afraid. afraid that when she came back, she might decide not to stay at all. The house was unbearably quiet without her. He had always associated silence with peace, but this silence was different. It wasn't soothing, it was hollow. He found himself wandering from room to room, looking for something to do, something to distract himself. He hadn't realized how much of his daily life revolved around her presence until she was gone. The absence of her humming in the kitchen, the missing scent of her perfume in the hallway, it was suffocating. He sat at the dining table alone that night, staring at the empty seat across from him. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? To be unbothered, to be the center of his own world? Yet, now that he had it, all he could think about was how much he had taken her for granted. He had assumed she would always be there, that her loyalty was permanent, unshakable. But nothing was permanent, not when love was neglected for too long. The next morning, he woke up with a gnawing discomfort, a realization that he had reached the edge of something irreversible. He needed to fix this, but for the first time, he wasn't sure how. Grand gestures wouldn't work, not anymore. She had given him chances for years, had forgiven his indifference 1,000 times over. This time, she needed something real. He needed to prove that he saw her, that he finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. He picked up his phone, hesitating before typing out a message. "I miss you." It was simple, but it was true. He stared at the screen for a long time before pressing send, his heart pounding in a way he wasn't used to. Would she respond? Would she ignore him? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He had always assumed he had the upper hand, that she would always be the one waiting. But now, for the first time, he was the one holding his breath. Hours passed without a response. He checked his phone more times than he cared to admit, every minute stretching endlessly. He had never been the one to wait, never been the one uncertain of where he stood. It was an unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling. Just when he had resigned himself to silence, his phone buzzed. A single message. "I miss who we used to be." The words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't saying she missed him, she missed something they had lost. And suddenly, he understood. This wasn't just about one night of humiliation or a single cruel remark. It was about all the times he had diminished her, dismissed her, made her feel small. She wasn't asking for an apology, she was asking if there was still something left worth saving. He spent the rest of the night thinking about what she had said. "I miss who we used to be." When had things changed? He thought back to the early days of their marriage, when they had been partners, when he had valued her thoughts, her presence, her love. He had once admired her strength, her kindness, her ability to see beauty in the smallest things. But over time, he had begun to see those qualities as lesser, unimportant. He had let his own ambition consume him, leaving no room for her in the world he had built. For years, she had tried to remind him of who they were, had fought for their love long after he had stopped. But now, she was no longer fighting. And that terrified him more than anything. He had spent so much time believing she would never leave that he had never considered what would happen if she simply stopped trying. Now, the question wasn't whether she would forgive him, it was whether she still wanted to. When she returned that Sunday evening, he was already waiting. He had spent the whole day preparing, cleaning the house, making dinner, things he had never done before, things she had always taken care of without thanks. When she walked through the door, she paused, surprised by the scent of fresh food in the air, by the quiet effort he had made. He stood in the kitchen, unsure of what to say, afraid that words would only cheapen what he was trying to show. She set her bag down, watching him carefully. You cooked? She asked, her voice unreadable. He nodded. I wanted to do something for you. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time he had truly considered what she might need instead of what he expected from her. He didn't know if it was enough. But he knew he had to start somewhere. They sat at the table, eating in silence. It wasn't tense, but it wasn't comfortable either. There was too much left unsaid, too much damage that a single meal couldn't erase. He took a deep breath, setting down his fork. I know I've been a terrible husband, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. I don't know when I stopped seeing you, but I did. And I'm sorry. She looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't the same man who had humiliated her that night at dinner. He looked smaller. Not in stature, but in the weight of his own realization. She sighed, placing her hands on the table. I don't want an apology just because you're afraid of losing me, she said softly. I want to know that you actually understand why I pulled away. And for the first time, he did. They spent the next few weeks rebuilding, not as husband and wife, but as two people learning how to be better to each other. He listened more, asked her questions, showed appreciation in ways he never had before. He made mistakes, of course. He caught himself slipping into old habits, into selfish assumptions. But each time, he corrected himself. And each time, she saw it. It wasn't easy. Healing never was. But for the first time, they were working towards something together, rather than apart. And slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could become the man she had once loved again. Months later, they found themselves at another dinner party, surrounded by colleagues and acquaintances. He could see the nervous tension in her shoulders, the memory of the last time still fresh in both their minds. But this time, when someone praised his career, he didn't let the conversation revolve around himself. Instead, he turned to her, taking her hand in his. I wouldn't be here without her, he said simply, sincerity lacing his words. She's the best part of my life. She felt the eyes of the room on her, but this time, there was no humiliation, no pain. Just warmth. Just truth. She looked at him, seeing a man who had finally learned what it meant to love someone fully. And as she squeezed his hand in return, she realized that, against all odds, they had found their way back to each other. Not because she had waited. Not because she had forgiven too easily. But because, this time, he had truly earned it.